good afternoon to everybody who is here and who is about to arrive. Thanks for joining California Lawyers for the Arts for Video Games Part 2, Anatomy of a Developer and the Publisher Relationship and Agreement. So this is actually the second part of a 2-week workshop series panel that we've kind of done. My name is Renee Reisman, and I'm the Educational Programs Coordinator for California Lawyers for the Arts in Los Angeles. But thanks to Zoom, we are statewide right now for all of our workshops. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly share a little bit about our organization and our services. California Lawyers for the Arts is a statewide nonprofit founded in 1974, serving artists and arts organizations. We currently have offices in San Francisco, Berkeley, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and San Diego. We offer memberships with benefits such as workshop discounts and archive content. So please go to our website, calawyersforthearts.org, for more information. I just want to mention the 3 core services we offer for the community. The first is our Lawyer Referral and Information Service, otherwise known as LRIS, which is a State Bar of California certified LRIS program that matches creative artists and attorneys throughout all of California. We also administer the California Inventors Assistance Program, otherwise known as CIAP, and that assists independent inventors and small startups with their patent legal issues. And sometimes in the game industry or the VR, AR field, that's an especially valuable service. So hopefully people in this workshop will check that out. Another service is our Arts Arbitration and Mediation Services, or AAMS, which provides low-cost community conflict resolution services. All mediations are voluntary, confidential, and seek to resolve disputes for the parties outside of court. And finally, our other prong is what you're here for this afternoon, and that's our educational programming, which we offer a variety of workshops, symposia, conferences on various legal topics for arts and organizations. So I wanted to thank all our panelists today for joining us. We have Keith Cooper, who is one of the partners at Morrison Rothman LLP, Douglas Nabors, who's the founder of FunTrain, Jordan Marks, the Vice President of Business and Legal Affairs at Annapurna Interactive, and Chris Wright, founder and Managing Director of Fellow Traveler. I'm going to hand it over to Keith right now, who I think will kick us off.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Hello, everybody. We are here, as Renee mentioned, this is part 2, our series on the developer-publisher relationship and agreement. So last week we introduced primarily the concept of copyright and trademark and certain things to understand the differences between those types of intellectual properties and the types that can be licensed to game. And the purpose of doing it kind of in this order is last week was designed to give you guys an introduction. I do see we have law students here, but if you guys are content creators, be it musicians or writers or artists, the games are just an amazing opportunity. And the games industry is absolutely exploding, not just during coronavirus, but even as of a couple of years ago, the revenue generated from the gaming industry surpassed the motion picture industry. I haven't looked recently, but it was up around $65–66 billion a year, which is more than the motion picture industry. I also understand during coronavirus, last month, the industry had $10 billion in revenue for a single month, which means coronavirus, bad for people, good for gaming. Because let's face it, none of us have anywhere to go. So we can sit here, we can play games, and we can't even watch TV and movies anymore because that content is drying up. But games are persistent. And just as an example, and I referenced last week my love of Red Dead Redemption 2, and one of the things that I love about games and game development and the gaming industry is a game like that. You know, it's got amazing artwork in it. It's got a map, which we talked about is copyrightable in and of itself. And you've got the story. It's got a very robust story, and we'll touch upon that later in terms of if you're developing a story and it is turned into a game or developed for a game, that IP can ultimately be developed for a movie, whether it's The Last of Us or other types of games. Many of them have gone on to become major motion pictures, Tomb Raider. I can go on and on. There's been several of them. So if you're writing a script, a screenplay, if you're writing a story, These things are amenable to gaming. Music, same thing. The artwork, all of these things, and that's what makes gaming so great as an industry, is it incorporates all of these independent intellectual property endeavors. So if you're a content creator and you're looking for an outlet, certainly the gaming industry is something to pay attention to and something you might be interested in. What we're doing today is the predominant topic here today is the anatomy of the publisher-developer agreement. And we do have an agreement that we're going to kind of go through to give you kind of the basic high-level overview of some of the terms and concepts that are contained in the agreement. And, I'm not going to do a dramatic reading of the publisher agreement. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce some concepts and some provisions, and then I'm going to ask our other panelists to discuss certain of these things based on their experience and the deals that they have done with various developers. Technically, I think all three are actually publishers. We don't really have a true developer here today that focuses exclusively on game development. So to the extent that somebody is going to play devil's advocate and take the developer position, I might do that, to represent, so to speak. So what I do want to talk about is just basic, to start, is the basic structure of this agreement. So as you can see this stuff right there, developer, publisher, developer, A, B, C, D, these are what's known as the recitals provision. And again, the recitals provisions include kind of, or have kind of two components to them. Really, what they are legally is factual admissions. You put something in an agreement here, you're basically admitting it to be true. But more importantly, I think from our perspective here, is the recitals provision is usually used to set up the relationship of the parties to give the contract some meaning. So here, for example, it starts with developer is experienced in the design, development, production, operation, etc. of interactive games, and the publisher is engaged in the business of publishing, marketing, distributing the games. So it sets up kind of what the parameters of the relationship are. And then it goes on and it says in paragraph C, publisher now desires to engage developer to design and develop such software. And this is kind of an early stopping point for us. In this, there are many types of agreements that you might encounter as you're doing this. Some might be just a straight up acquisition. If a developer has developed a property, and this happens regularly, but they want to get a publishing deal in order to basically exploit, which is another way of saying monetize, distribute the game, they will go to a publisher like one of the gentlemen we have on our panel here today, and they'll say, hey, here's a product that I have, would love to show it to the world and make money off of it. You guys, publisher, as you can see in recital provision B here, you guys are in the business of publishing, marketing, and distributing. These are three separate functions here, but especially where the marketing and distributing aspect is concerned, marketing is a function where somebody's going to pay for advertisements and get the word out and do all sorts of things to help promote the game, for lack of a better word. Distributing it is something altogether different. And distributing the game, it's almost a seminar into it and of itself. But where distribution is concerned, that model has changed significantly in the last 10, 15 years, really probably even longer than that. But distribution, as you've seen, and say goodbye to stores like GameStop that are just like Blockbuster, right? Blockbuster used to have a physical distribution model where you would package up a game and the publisher would get it into the stores, whereas now games are published using the Epic Game Store or Steam, Steam probably being the largest in the world, I think, for game distribution. And getting those games onto Steam, there's a lot of parameters that are involved in there that the publisher typically is knowledgeable about and knows how to comply with and get these things so that they are eventually distributed in there. But in this particular game, you'll see the interesting language here in section C, where it says, publisher now desires to engage developer to design and develop such software. So that's an indication right there at the outset that there might not be a pre-existing property, again, intellectual property, a story, artwork, games, all of these things that we talked about last week. There might not be anything currently in existence, or to the extent that it is in existence, the publisher is hiring the developer to complete it so that they have a completed game so they can market and distribute it. Then the D is kind of an interesting one to me here, because it's in the recitals provision, and it says developer is willing to so design and develop publication by publisher software game. And if you read through it, it says, including without limitation the game. We'll talk about that later. But they are willing, I'm emphasizing that word, to otherwise perform the services set forth in the agreement, all in an exceptional manner. And the reason this is an interesting provision to me is they haven't actually agreed to do anything yet. They're willing to do it, and they put it in the recitals portion that they're willing to produce a game in an exceptional manner, but that's different from the body of the agreement itself, which talks about the state of the game. Sometimes you might see it referred to, they'll deliver a game commercially satisfactory to the publisher or of a first-rate quality. You know, but these types of things, just so you pay attention to it when you're negotiating these agreements or looking at them, what does that even mean if you do agree to provide something in an exceptional manner? I have no idea what that actually means. There might be a standard. You're saying it's going to be something more than just basic, rudimentary, whatever. But these are the types of terms that are a little bit ambiguous. Oftentimes we see we'll do something in a commercially reasonable fashion, or we'll make best efforts to do something, as opposed to reasonable efforts to do something. And those are legal terms that you look out for these types of buzzwords, and particularly when the publisher and developer are negotiating these agreements, what is it that the publisher is asking of the developer? And what, more importantly, what is it that the developer, what are the expectations that are established here when you're putting something like that in there, so that both the publisher and the developer have an understanding? And what I mean by that is this, and then I've got a question for the group, but what I mean by that is simply contracts are really only so good as they are written, right? The purpose of a contract is not to address each and every potential problem that can arise. Invariably, no matter how good the contract is, things might pop up that neither side really anticipated. What we try to do when we're negotiating, more importantly, drafting, that's what I do, drafting the agreement, is to eliminate as much ambiguity in the contract as possible, because that's where the disputes arise later. Because the contract says what the contract says, but if it's ambiguous, that leads to dispute. And what I mean by ambiguous or ambiguity in a contract is a term or a phrase or a word is subject to more than one meaning. So if you see something in there that says, you know, for example, kind of off topic, but if you're a witness in a case and you say, hey, and the attorney asks, hey, so this person was some distance from you when they did blank, right? I don't even know what that means. Some distance is an inch, it's 5 inches, it's 5 feet, it's 40 feet, or a mile. I don't know what that means. Those are the types of terms that we want to avoid here. So I'd like to go around to each of the guys here and just ask, you know, when you're doing this and you are asking for a developer to develop something for you, something that doesn't exist, but you're asking them to develop something in a first-rate manner or in an exceptional manner or whatever it is, what is it that you're looking for from the developer, and what would you like to see in terms of the language in the agreement to ensure that the developer understands what your expectations are for delivery of the product that they're developing? So just starting with you, Douglas, I'll ask that question.
First of all, I want to say that we're a VR company, right? So, and we're strictly a VR company, unlike, I think Chris is not, but I think Jordan, I think you guys dabble. And it's still a very new medium. So what is good, what is not good, these ideas are kind of vague at this point. You know, it's just being such a new industry, at least in my opinion. And so what we look at when we're trying to basically ensure a certain quality of product, because the way that we work is we typically work for hire development teams based on IP that we have acquired, and we do need a certain level of quality because we want a marketable product, but we also have an obligation to our licensors to maintain a certain level of quality. And if this is, you were talking about quality, right, Keith? Is that correct?
Yeah, in terms of the qualitative aspects, your expectations.
I mean, how deep is how deep is a hole, and it's that idea of what's good and what isn't. But what we usually do is we have, there's no way to ensure that what the development team you're working with is going to deliver a top quality, because there's not a really concrete or finite way to measure quality other than other products on the market that are competing products, et cetera. So does your product measure up? But we look at basic functionality. Does it work? Does the game load? As far as like the ground floor metrics of quality, does the game load? Can you quit the game? Does it work on minimum spec systems? Things of that nature. So we have a checklist of items that we want to ensure that the developer hits that are more on the technical side than the creative side, because what is a good product is it's so subjective and open to some creative interpretation. So as long as we can check the boxes of our technical requirements, does the game hit a target length? I know a lot of people judge quality based on the length of a title. So we also have target lengths for our product. So does it hit that target length? Those basic things. In short, I know that's a long answer, but that's pretty much how we measure quality. And then coming back in a contract and saying, well, those things are very easy to identify. Well, you said in the agreement this would work, and it doesn't work. It crashes upon load. So we need to fix that. So
let me just jump in with one thing, and then we can go on to Chris and Jordan. But one thing, if people want to look at provision D, again, this is still in the recital section, but there is reference to what Douglas is alluding to here when it's talking about that the game and the application set out in the applicable schedules as defined below. And this is the sort of thing that we would attach a schedule to the agreement. And where this type of development is concerned, the publisher is usually going to have deliverable milestones in here so that they can maintain quality control over this, so that periodically the developer would submit the product, and periodically, rather than waiting to get the final version and saying, no, this sucks, it doesn't work, usually you say, hey, let's have the first build. Sometimes maybe it's an alpha build, or even before the alpha build, and you guys can address this better than me, but it might be broken down even before you get to what I think would be considered an alpha build. For anyone that doesn't know, the alpha build is typically the internal testing build. Hopefully I'm right about that, but it's the internal testing build of the game so that they can see what problems exist. And beta, they open it up for broader testing. Alpha, they might have early testing and bring people in to kind of test the features and the functions of the game. But it would be at this stage, if you're submitting certain components on a schedule, the publisher would then have the opportunity to say, this is satisfactory or it's not. And typically we would put something in there that says, we can reject this, but we'll give you X amount of days to resubmit it. And if it fails the second time, we can terminate the agreement. Sometimes we give third or even fourth bites at the apple. But that process is built into this. So it's not necessarily the whole game that you're waiting for. It might be developed according to these schedules. I don't know, Chris, you want to chime in?
Yes, I think a key thing kind of depends on the nature of the contract and the agreement itself, and also what are you going to do if the game is not at quality, right? So if you're paying for the whole development, work for hire, it's much more important there to obviously set the quality bar, because there's going to be much more emphasis on you do the work, you get paid for the work. In our case, where we're funding maybe part of the game, but it's come to us from a developer, if the game's not shaping up on quality, it's rarely that we're holding like the power in that situation on the money. Like the money's part of it, but equally, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, well, here's have the rights back, right? In which case you're basically writing off the money you've spent. So in the situations we've had where the game is just really not coming together, it's always just been a conversation around, hey, this is not really happening. We're going to basically write off our investment, give you guys the rights back so you can take this forwards. And there's a conversation around that at that point. It's not so much like, okay, you're going to have to fix all this up at your own expense. And because the indie developers we deal with, if they don't have money, they often like can't develop the game, right? They're literally, you know, paying for their living expenses and kind of running pretty lean. That's very different if you're hiring like a studio of 30 people that's a ongoing business that has its own capital and other projects, right? You're dealing with different people. So for us, obviously quality is important, and we won't ship a game if it's not at quality, and that's a dialogue with the developer. But it's not so much, it's rare that you have like that kind of like, okay, you're not delivering, you've got to go back now and do this, and it's going to cost you. It's more, this isn't coming together, we'll need to work together to put some more money in to fund more time. And is it worth doing that?
I think, Chris, before we get to Jordan, two things. There is a question, but Chris, to the extent you want to talk about it, do you want to talk about the real world situation where a developer is failing in that regard? Or I'm sorry, I meant Douglas, sorry. This might be a good situation where a developer is failing to perform. If, to the extent you want to talk about it, what do you do?
Yeah, money. I mean, obviously, well, just to go back for a second on how do you contractually dictate quality is very difficult. I mean, and then maybe I'm misunderstanding the initial question, but I think that it's trying to, there's an agreement ahead of time in what the game you're making, you know, ahead of time. We use a game design document, you know, which is part of our process. We also have an RFP process whereby we are pitched by development teams. This is the type of game we want to make, and this is the quality at which we want to make it. So that becomes like the measure of quality from an ongoing. So if I, and the second part of your question was what, Keith?
To the extent that you want to talk about the real world situation.
Oh, sure. Well, just like Chris said, I mean, this is a financial, it's a business, right? And so this is a financial, there's financial consideration. The use of milestones is very helpful during the development process, and we get in the weeds as far as like the gray box or the white box or whatever you want to call it, which is basically the blueprints of the game, even the game design document, all the way through alphas, betas, and on. And if we see things going sideways or the train coming off the tracks, it's a conversation first and foremost, and there's best efforts are made to right things. But then if there's not, then we do our best to, those financial milestones are there to ensure quality and are there to ensure items are delivered on time and at a certain quality. And so it's hard, once you get to a certain point in the title, it's hard to pull the string, like Chris said, it's hard to pull the plug because you've got so much into the title already. But you can use those milestones and those financial incentives to try to bring things back into line or back onto schedule or back up to a quality. And sometimes it's a problem that money can't fix, you know, and sometimes it's a problem, you know, right now we're dealing with COVID, right? And so we have development teams that have scattered around the world and are doing their best to keep it together and keep the schedule going. So money is one way to handle it. Another way is to reduce the services and maybe hand services to another development team if you have that ability to split services. I don't know if that answers.
It does. And
yeah.
I think before we let Jordan jump in, to answer the question here, it's a great question. I believe the answer, and you can ask the publishers directly, but yes, I believe the publishers do understand the development cycle and need to understand the development cycle. And yes, sometimes there is a disconnect in there, which is why we prepare the contracts the way that we do. And we try, and this contract that you guys were looking at, this contract is 33 pages, I think. If I had attached the development cycle portion to it, it would have been 60 pages. There was another roughly 30 pages of deliverables, milestones, the scope of work, the scope of services, all of these things set forth in real detail. And what I think Douglas was alluding to, by the way, is progress payments. Basically that you say, you deliver, you get paid. If it gets rejected, you don't get paid. Resubmit it. If it's acceptable, you get paid. So we will oftentimes negotiate what constitutes acceptance and what constitutes delivery. And sometimes in there, we have a provision that says, hey, if the developer delivers something, but the publisher is too busy to get to it within a certain amount of time, if I'm representing the developer, I fight this fight from time to time, if I'm representing the developer, I want to put a provision in there that says, if you don't respond to me within 5 days, that always gets rejected, but sometimes, but 7, 10, whatever days, then it's deemed accepted by you, in which case that triggers your payment obligation to me. But yeah, the developers, these guys here, all, in my opinion, in my experience working with them, all understand the realities, as Douglas just mentioned, COVID being one of them, of the development cycle. Jordan, what are your thoughts?
To jump back way to the beginning, I think, your question about how to spell out, what your expectations are in an agreement. I think to some extent, agreements serve two functions. One is to set expectations, and the other would be to give guidance as to what would happen in terms of a dispute, right? And in terms of drafting agreements and phrasing things and sentence structure and word choice and, best efforts versus good faith efforts versus reasonable efforts, I think part of that is that setting expectations, right? So from the perspective of one side of the table, you want to set the expectation of, this is a firm obligation. So you have to deliver this thing on this date, or you have to use as much effort as you can generate to do this thing or to perform this way. Whereas this other clause might, be something that's more reasonable, where it's not a firm obligation to do something. And so part of that is setting your expectations of what you're asking the other party to do. And then, with respect to the second part of drafting and looking at contracts is often, like what Douglas was alluding to as well, which is like, what do you do in the event of a dispute? And oftentimes disputes come in the form of, a failure to perform an obligation in an agreement, or if you're, sometimes you might go back to a contract and look, at particular language if you're feeling uneasy about a party's performance of an obligation. So that's in terms of kind of literally drafting contracts. I think those are kind of two things to keep in mind. There is this sense oftentimes with contracts that, all of this effort goes into sort of the deal making process and generating a contract. And then kind of in practice on the ground for the next 6 months, 3 years of time, however long it is, we might not really look at the contract. We might just sort of work together hand in hand, developer and publisher, or party to party, and kind of do what feels best for the project and what's in best service of our relationship together. And that's kind of when we would maybe never go back to the contract, or only go back to the contract in the event that there was something we didn't feel quite right about. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. In terms of progress payments and milestones, and this idea that, video game contracts are often set up on kind of a performance payment or milestone basis, I kind of like to think of it in terms of the time of performance. Like if you can imagine, if you're shooting a movie, right, and you're hiring an actor to play a role in your movie, and you're a producer, let's say, in theory, you're on set every single day, right? And so that actor or actress is showing up every single day and performing their services, and you're watching those services being performed. That might last a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, right? And then perhaps it's over. Video games oftentimes take a longer period of time. You could have development phases that go on for years and years. And so the idea that, someone might develop or create something and then it's delivered at the end of that, let's call it 3-year period, and then you the publisher or the financier or the person who's taking delivery of it would review it at that point and then give notes and feedback. That would kind of be an arduous process, right? Because during that long term of creation, the developer, let's say, may have deviated off the path of expectation of what we set out when we wrote that agreement. So by having these milestones, which might be monthly, they might be quarterly, they might be every other month, and having these mechanisms of approval and deliverables and payments, on a milestone basis or a progress, payment basis, gives someone like a publisher the opportunity to check in with the developer and literally see what's being developed. And then, like what Chris and Douglas were talking about, if it's not meeting those standards, having a conversation and trying to remedy, and in the event that it's not remediable, maybe stopping progress. But that way you don't end up at the end of the development cycle with something that was not what both parties expected.
So two things. One, two of you introduced the concept of work for hire. I just want to touch on that briefly. What a work for hire is, that's very specific language. It is based on the United States copyright laws, the United States Copyright Act, that if something is created as a work for hire, it means the person that is creating it for the person to own. So essentially, if Jordan hires me to develop something as a work for hire, if I'm an employee of Jordan, everything I create is owned by Jordan, or in Jordan's case, Annapurna. But if it's a work for hire, that's typically, you see that if I'm an independent contractor, he says, you're not my employee, but here's an independent contractor agreement. Everything that you create is owned by me, Annapurna. So I wanted people to understand, that concept. But my quick question, I want to keep this one quick, but each of you, if there are problems during the development cycle, how amenable are each of you to say, hey, we understand the problems, let's agree, because contracts, this one included, requires mutual consent to modify the contract. How willing are you guys as publishers to go back and modify a contract to accommodate the problems that have arisen during the development cycle?
I think for us, and just in general, everything is a conversation to be had, right? And so to kind of go back to the question that was in the chat and kind of what Keith was speaking to earlier, I think you do really want a sort of lockstep, hand-in-hand, symbiotic relationship between developer and publisher, right? And the publisher should understand all of the different, cycles and phases of development. So if there is something that comes up that's a deviation or unexpected in terms of where the game has progressed to, right? I think in terms of modifying contracts, we're always open to consider that. But going back to what Douglas said earlier, everything, this is to some extent, a business, right? And so you always then have to go back and look at things through the lens of the business decision, right? And so sure, we can modify things, but does that make sense in terms of our business and what was anticipated, or even from a creative perspective, which is not my personal forte, but like, does that, make sense creatively to the project as well? Does that meet those expectations that we originally set out when we decided to do this together?
I'm with Jordan. We're very hesitant to modify a PSA, or what we call a production service agreement, because as Jordan pointed out, that's always the initial expectations that were set. Now we can easily forgive certain portions of that, or say I can think of one recent example where we had a team where we greatly reduced the scope of the product by almost nearly 40%, but we still kept the full scope of services in the contract themselves. But it's just our prerogative on the business side to forgive that 40% of services that aren't going to be rendered. But we like to work through exhibits. So we like to work through like an additional exhibits that ride on top of the production services agreement that will outline new scopes of work. Say, for example, a new emerging platform has come out, and we want to add this to the production services agreement. Well, that will just be an exhibit that we can clarify new expectations or a new scope of work with new compensation structures, et cetera, while keeping the original production services agreement, if that makes sense.
No, it does, yeah. And for people listening, basically, and it's similar to that here in this agreement. What he's talking about is in the master services agreement, you basically set forth the general parameters of the agreement with the intent that they never change. And one of the things in there is typically a provision which will state that a waiver of a party's rights that on one occasion does not constitute a waiver on all occasions. And again, especially for law students, you look at that because if you waive rights under a contract, so the argument goes, you're basically waiving all your rights. So we put in here a provision that says, hey, we might grant you some leeway. We might not enforce our rights in this circumstance, but that does not mean we're not enforcing it the next time or the next situation. But the attachments that I've removed from this, and we'll see in a second, are what Douglas is talking about. You have the one agreement, it's immutable for the most part, or you want it to be, and you can substitute new exhibits in and out to change the service schedules and the scope of work. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, same thing. I think I can't remember an occasion where we've altered the main section of the contract, but the majority of our games would have a change to the schedule at some point. And I think when you're dealing with creative products, it's important not to lock the developer in too tightly to their milestone schedule, because 2 years before the game ships, what they think they're going to do, 18 months from now, what priorities are going to be on what parts of the game to be delivered. That's just what they think right then. It may be that 6 months in, they're like, actually, we need to build these tools before we build the levels. We thought we were going to do the levels first and then this, but actually it's better to do it the other way. And if you force them to operate too tightly within the schedule, it can actually really hamper the quality of the game. So you need to, I think, be fluid around those things whilst being firm on some, the most important thing is development under control? Is it moving forwards? Does it feel like it's going to hit the goal at the end on track or not? And if they need to shift around what they're doing this month or next month, that's usually fine and can be done really quickly in the schedule. If it's like, hey, we're going to drop this platform or whatever, then that's a bigger kind of conversation. But you want it to be a little bit fluid, because game development needs to be a little bit fluid. Particularly, I think at different scales it differs. If you're running a 100-person team, you can't change what you're doing next month, right? But if you're a 2-person team, they're fluid, they're nimble, and you have to let them operate that way.
Okay. So in the agreement, number 1 here, it talks about the development services, which is basically what we've been talking about. But as you notice, it says publisher hereby engages developer to provide the services, and that's a defined term. And you always look for these sorts of things in here. Whenever you are drafting contracts, whenever you're reviewing contracts, always be on the lookout for capitalized words, because they are supposed to be, and they're not always. Sometimes people use capitalized terms and they never took the time to define it. And me, I'm always like, WTF, okay? What does this mean? Why is it supposed to be a defined term but lacks a definition? We'll come to that in a second, but here it talks about to purposes, but notice that it says, as described in the project schedules that will be executed by the parties from time to time, and then defined term schedules. Okay, the first of which is attached to Schedule 1. And so that's what we're looking at here, so that those schedules can change and be modified without modifying the entire agreement. And so that's why this is listed. And then you look at even further, they say the developer is not going to commence work on any of the services under these schedules until they've signed it, which obviously is key. I don't always see that, by the way, in these agreements. Very often it just says, hey, we'll do the services according to the schedule, and the schedule is the schedule, and then people fail to meet the guidelines in the schedule and problems arise. This actually is really good, where you say sign here for each and every time that we have a schedule or a new schedule or a modified schedule, to ensure that they are committing pen to paper, to use an old school term, that they agree with the services or the schedule that's contained. And in fact, they go further here in number 1, where they say each schedule will be a separate agreement by the parties that incorporates the terms of this agreement. That's kind of key language here. Always look for that, and any of you that are reviewing contracts, you'll always say attached here to is Exhibit A. It's usually the reverse. Exhibit A, which is incorporated into this agreement, okay? And you look for that sort of language in here, because what that triggers is legally you're saying This exhibit is now actually part of the agreement. They're doing it in reverse here just as well. They're doing it in reverse, saying this agreement is incorporated into these whatever schedule changes. So this is a good way to go about it, and just it's kind of in reverse, but it's really good. Section 1 generally lays out what the services are and the scope of the services, and those should be contained with as much precision as you can muster in the attachments there to avoid these sorts of disputes. This one also talks about developer on page 2 here. Developer will provide post-delivery development services, support and maintenance services. That comes in a variety of areas. Typically, we do want to see that included in a separate schedule, because if I'm the developer, for example, I might agree to do some maintenance services. Bug fixing is a separate issue, and bug fixing, probably is best pre-release, but these days things are released early access and in beta and all sorts of methods that bug fixing is not like the old school days where you just get a DVD and presumably all the bugs have been worked out. Now you can get software to upgrade, upload, to fix a lot of these things. But in any case, what is the developer's obligation there is really what they're saying. If I'm the developer, I want to limit my obligations. Sure, I take pride in my work. I want to make sure it runs properly. I don't want to give you something that's buggy. If it is, I'll fix it. But oftentimes, the publisher will hammer the developer repeatedly, saying this needs to be fixed or that needs to be fixed. And after a while, where do you draw the line? At some point, it becomes a full-time obligation just to maintain this thing when you kind of want to move on to your next development. So these are negotiated points, and they're good to include in there. Oftentimes, what we include in there, we're saying you'll provide certain maintenance support services for a certain period of time, or for a certain flat fee, or a certain amount, after which we will charge you our regular hourly rate, whatever that might be, to continue to maintain it. That's something that is negotiated and something that we see. Probably the most important, or among the most important thing, is the upcoming paragraph. I'm going to skip over section 2 here, which is the defined terms. And the reason I'm skipping over the defined terms is because these will tell you what the terms are, but each and every one of these things as a defined term, we would encounter later in the agreement. And it's what makes reviewing these agreements complicated, because you will read these agreements and you'll come across a term later in the agreement, then you have to go, oh God, I got to jump back to page 2, and I have to try to figure out what that means so I can reread the paragraph that I'm looking at, now understanding what the defined term is. It's very difficult. Sure, you want to read through this so you have an understanding, but you want to have these defined terms handy at all times, so when you're reading through the agreement, you can easily go back and see what it means, because it's defined. And you will find in agreements from time to time, something was supposed to be a defined term, as I mentioned, and it isn't there. And when you're drafting contracts, this is why it's very important, and drafting the contracts takes time, because you want to get these defined terms in there, and it's nice to have a section here like this one, section 2, where you define each and every one of the terms. And keys, take a look, for example, at 2.1.12. If you look at that, it's a good example of the term platform. We're talking about distribution. We're talking about development for a specified platform. And so here is where you'll see these are the platforms that we're looking for in here. In this case, I'm looking down here close to the bottom. It talks about you're developing, or the platform that you're developing for is PS4, but they included important language here, which is omitted from a contract we just looked at yesterday, which it talked about a developer PS4, and we're thinking, wait a minute, PS5 is coming up. So they anticipated that, and they put PS4 and its successors, Xbox One and its successors. This was very good anticipating future platforms. Oftentimes you'll see language in there that says for these platforms and any future platforms as may hereinafter be developed, or something like that type of language here. Of course, you want to look at things like source code and third-party materials, and we would encounter that. But here's where it gets important. If you go to 2.2, this is the essence of this agreement in large part, and that is, this is where we find rights, okay? And these are the grant of rights from the developer to the publisher. The developer is granting a right to the publisher here, and all of this is set forth here on the schedule. But the most important things here are in 2.21, 2.22, and all that type of stuff, because these are really mostly under copyright law that we talked about last week. For those of you that attended, I think it's the bundle of rights we alluded to, enumerated in Section 106 of the Copyright Act. It includes, the copyrights include the right to make copies. It includes the right to distribute the work. Okay, and here you're seeing, and to modify it, that's a derivative work. And here, these rights are expressly granted in here, that the developer is granting the right to the publisher to use, copy, modify the game, the source code, etc. Then you get to 2.2, and it talks about they are also being granted the right to distribute it, to perform it. That's one of those rights we talked about last week. The public performance rights of a copyrighted work. They are granted that right here to distribute, to perform, to sell, rent, merchandise, all of this stuff that's in here. And then you look at here, now we see a slew of defined terms. They're getting the right to market the game. So you go back and you say, well, what is the game? And then you look in your defined terms, and we would expect to see here, 2.1.6, it says what the game is. It's individual, collectively, the software applications and or related technology to be developed by developer. And then some without limitation, including without limitation, that which is in the applicable schedule. But these you want to see, and Chris, I'll throw it to you for just a second. We encountered a problem where the game, if you recall, was defined as actually 4 separate games in there. So, like, how do we address that, going forward when we see that in this sort of an agreement? The clarity, the precision with actually defining what the game is, since that's what the rights are granted.
I mean, if we're doing that contract again, we would have modified, I think, the language a little bit further, or had separate agreements. Well, separate agreements per game is a bit of a challenge, because it's kind of like, okay, do you really want 5 contracts for one deal? But yeah, I think a multi-game is challenging.
So for everybody's benefit, really the game, as it was defined, included 4 different games. And where it ran into problems was in this milestone schedule and everything else, saying what's delivered, what's not been delivered. The game was delivered or it wasn't. We haven't delivered all 4 things. So these are reasons why you want that sort of precision in your defined terms. But here they talk about additional content. So you want to see how additional content is defined, and they did a pretty good job delineating that here. And then, art, what that is, what marketing materials are, all of these things, you go back and you look at the defined term, and from our perspective, the importance obviously is, if you're the publisher, you need to know exactly what rights you're getting, and if you're the developer, you need to know exactly what you're expected to deliver. But here's always an interesting one, because this is kind of unique to our industry here. Among other things, they're talking about localized versions. So for you guys, we ran into this we ran into this issue recently as to who's responsible for preparing localized versions of a game. So can you guys go ahead and explain basically what the localized versions are, who you want to create those localized versions, and who you want to pay for the localization of products? Chris, you're on my screen now. Let's start with you.
So look, in our contracts, localization is a development responsibility because it's part of the IP and the developer keeps the IP. So we see it as a development process. However, it's often part of the funding conversations around who's going to pay for it, and we typically support and coordinate. So for us, it's like a development ownership supported by publisher. But that will differ, like if you own the IP as a publisher, then you'll maybe take more
So by
ownership of that
creating, just so
process.
everybody is on the same page, creating like a localized version could be anything from changing the artwork because what sells in the Japanese market may not sell here, or language, right? Somebody has to create it in German or Japanese or whatever, right? That's part of this process.
Yeah, exactly. So typically, particularly nowadays, like China is probably the #1 most important language to localize into, Russia, Brazilian Portuguese. But we've done some games like NeoCab, which is on Apple Arcade. Everything in Apple Arcade is localized into 14 languages plus like 4 different versions of English, a couple of different versions of French, a couple of different versions of Spanish. So that's a huge job to convert the text, etc., into all those different languages.
What about Douglas and Jordan?
Localization, kind of like Chris, localization is often we wrap that into the services of the development teams, even though that it's not their IP. We're sharing in a sense, because on the development side, we kind of request systems that make localization easy, and we request certain sorts of formats of localization. And it's hard to explain without getting technical, but basically one big text file that the game references that we can then change out. And we don't localize art assets typically unless they're blatantly regional. We localize mostly text, in-game text. We don't really localize language. We're a smaller company, so we don't cast. We have voice performers in our titles, and we don't really localize for those voice performers either. So we don't have like a German performer doing an English part, but we do a lot of text localization. So it's a negotiation. It's part of the services, or it isn't, and we negotiate. And typically we pay for the translation costs, because sometimes those can be pricey. So we will cover the costs of the localization, but it's the responsibility of the development team to implement those. And we also, unless a platform may be paying, which has happened before, a platform has actually covered the localization costs and has added additional languages. Typically, we choose 3 to 4 languages that we think are key, and those decisions are based on what our data tells us as where our products sell the most, and so that we want to play into those markets specifically. So we don't sell a lot in China. In fact, we're hoping to sell more, but we don't sell a lot in China. So we don't localize a lot yet in simplified Chinese, but we do sell a lot in Germany. So German to us is kind of, or French is an important language for us to localize. Our product, we did The Exorcist, and we know that this is like sort of a religious, demonic possession is big in Latin American countries, and we knew we were going to sell less, so we localized that in Spanish. So those kind of decisions were made, and I hope that answers your question. It's part of the contract, it's negotiated, but typically we split the costs. We cover the costs of the translations themselves and sourcing those translations. The development team covers the costs of implementing those translations.
All right, and Jordan, how do you guys approach it?
Yeah, it's very similar to what Douglas just said. So oftentimes, it is all subject to negotiation, but typically, on the publisher side, we would actually pay for the translations themselves and do that side of the work, and then the developer would then implement them. And also, like Douglas said, you could, in some territories, or if you have publishers or subsequent distributors that have certain regional mandates or requirements, or that are more complicated to localize for, there are instances where they might pay and contribute some, either monetary or functional effort towards, having the game localized for their region specifically that they're targeting. So, but typically we handle it in conjunction with the developer.
So this is a slight digression, I guess, something that we would normally see in this agreement, and I'm going a little out of order because the agreement is too big. But these grant of rights that we're talking about, this is a license, and for just garden variety licenses, license agreements are fairly straightforward and easy at their basic level, and they're a grant of rights typically for a term. And so the term has to be defined, and hopefully we'll have time to get to it. But the other thing is the territory is also defined. And I'm raising it now based on something that Douglas was just talking about just a minute ago. We don't sell much in China, this, that, or the other thing. If you're on the developer side, if I'm the developer and I'm looking for a publisher, I'm looking for somebody that has, depending upon obviously resources, but I'm also looking for somebody that has worldwide distribution, publishing capabilities. And a lot of publishers, for example, might have the ability to publish in North America, but not Europe or Asia or something like that. So this is a negotiated term with the developer, and publishers might use sub-publishing agreement. They might want the rights to be granted to them on, quote, worldwide, which would sometimes you see the universe. I still don't understand that, but it's worldwide. But what you're looking for here is these rights are granted. In a license, you might be limited in the rights that you receive as the publisher. Maybe it could be limited in term, but it could be limited in territory as well. And territory is always, or can be, a negotiated or a hotly negotiated point. So from your guys' perspective, are there, starting with you, Jordan, you're on the screen, with the territory, presumably, I mean, do you always want to get worldwide rights for distribution? And I know it's easier in the digital distribution age, but there are other issues. But do you want to get worldwide rights, or are you amenable to either saying we'll get a sub-publisher for certain territories, or we don't want the rights for certain parts of the world? How do each of you guys approach that, starting with you, Jordan?
It's hard to speak in absolutes because it could be something that we just haven't come across before, or it could be a component of a deal that we just haven't done yet. But typically, we would want worldwide distribution, or at least the ability to distribute worldwide or universe-wide, such that, I think from a sort of general publishing perspective, if you're investing into a creative product, you would want the ability to exploit and distribute and sort of enjoy the success of that product in as many places as possible, or with the fewest number of restrictions as possible. So that would typically inform that decision. But that isn't to say that if a project or something came along that had territorial complications or different interests involved, that we wouldn't consider it, certainly. But typically you would want as many rights as possible.
We also request it's a little bit different for us. I mean, sometimes it's dictated by the license. We do license product only, so sometimes it's dictated on the license side what territories that we have. But we typically request worldwide. And this isn't the film and television business. There's these ridiculous carve outs for territories, North America, South America, European sales, and it's kind of like that's from the old. As far as I'm concerned, those are dinosaur kind of carve outs these days. I mean, we kind of live in a world market. These platforms sell globally, so we almost insist on global. We may hold China. We simply don't have a Chinese platform partner that we're confident in working with yet. But did that answer your question, Keith, more or less?
Yeah, it does. And I think a distinction maybe should be made between still physical product and digital product, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a publisher and you're still using physical product, you have to get that into physical locations in parts of the world you might not be able to.
We're digital. I mean, it's 2020 now, and we're a digital distribution. That's it. Yeah. And there's opportunities that have presented themselves to do physical releases specifically on PlayStation, but those scenarios simply just don't make a lot of financial sense anymore in this even now. I mean, that things have changed in the past couple of months. Now who's going to GameStop to buy games anymore? Nobody. If we would carve out a territory, we would allow developers, if they really wanted to, have some territory. It's also a discussion, always a discussion. Like, we'll give them New Zealand. New Zealand they could keep. That's the one that we don't care about, but that's
all right. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, it's very similar to what Jordan said. Like, from a publisher point of view, it's not just territory, it's also platforms. Our view is that we're partnering with the developer on the journey with the game, right? And when you sign the game, you're not quite sure where that journey will go. So you might sign the game, and then a year into that, Apple Arcade suddenly appears, and you want to make sure that as the publisher, you can go with the developer for that opportunity, and you don't have to kind of go back to the contract and negotiate the rights to something, because that holds you up too much. So our view is like, it's a partnership. It's like getting married. We're in this together. And if you start carving stuff out, then suddenly you're not in it together. It's like they've got a mistress, essentially, right? And that's not that doesn't work out well. In circumstances where they've got an existing deal, or they're really, specific about one particular thing, there's a bit of flexibility, but in principle, it should be together as much as possible.
With video games, I think, as compared to the film and television industry, like there are technical considerations with respect to territories as well, right? Some platforms and platform, operator agreements will only accept worldwide, grants of rights to be able to publish on the platform, right? And Steam, I think you can toggle territory by territory, right? But other platforms, it's more complicated, and they might only accept a worldwide grant. So I think when doing these deals, it's from a publisher perspective, it's not even just, what rights do we want as a publisher, but what rights do we need? And like what Douglas was saying too, just to be able to put the property out in the manner that it needs to be, So that's an important consideration as well, as what platforms are you targeting, and what are their limitations in terms of territorial, carving out and whatnot.
Where ratings are concerned, since we're talking about distribution and distribution on various platforms, you have the ESRB ratings that may or may not apply. In the developer-publisher deal agreement, how do you handle that? Who do you want to handle that and take responsibility for that? Chris, I think we had a long conversation about this recently. Can you address that?
Yeah, sure. So it's definitely a publisher responsibility in our view. It's part of the distribution process, and we handle that for our developers. But the developers need to essentially deliver the materials that we need to submit. So they have to give us the code, they have to give us the information, they have to tell us if there's mature language or what content's in the game to make sure we can go ahead and do that. And it's up to the publisher to ultimately determine which ratings to get and which markets therefore to ship into. So these days it's much simpler. You have what's called IARC. Essentially, it's one simple questionnaire that applies to almost every country. And the only major platform that doesn't accept that right now is PlayStation in Europe and Nintendo Switch in Japan, essentially. And I think maybe one other market. There's a couple of markets like Korea and Japan that are kind of holding out on this stuff. So you can essentially get a rating now for almost the whole of the world in about 10 minutes of process, right? And then you have to do a bit more work in certain markets. If you're doing physical releases, that's a different thing. Then you suddenly need to get like a PEGI rating for Europe and a different one for the UK and a different one for Australia, and New Zealand has a separate rating if you've got a mature game. So that then gets super complex. But in digital, it's quite simple.
And how do you guys, Jordan and Douglas, how do you guys handle responsibility for ratings, securing ratings?
Well, exactly what Chris said. It's a publisher responsibility. It's as easy as Chris said for most, especially if you're releasing a digital product, ESRB, and then the IARC. When we set out our expectations with our developers, we set out with a rating in mind, because we know a certain market, a demographic that we're trying to hit with a certain type of product. Right? We don't make the product and find out the demo later. So we know, for example, a title we're working on now, we know we want to hit a teen rating, so that we have certain criteria that we know. And the teen rating is a very short laundry list of items that must not be in the game in order to achieve that teen rating. So we ensure that the developer throughout the development process does not, incorporate that. Like, you can't have a severed head, or you can't have overt sexuality, or you can't have drug use or things of that nature in a teen-rated game. So we know what the hot spots are, and we avoid those, and to ensure that we get the rating that we need to when the time comes. But at the end of the day, it is the publisher's responsibility to make that application and then make changes. And if you get re-rated, it's the publisher. It's on the publisher, not the developer. We recently got re-rated on a title from teen to mature, and we took a hit as a result. So
Jordan, how do you guys handle that? Picking up on what Douglas was saying, because it's super interesting to me, is you're watching during the development process. You have a target rating in mind, I take it, at the outset. So are you closely monitoring what the developer is providing you to make sure that you're not going to run into these rating problems during the process?
It's not something I personally am involved with as much, but I can say just generally, like, I think like what Chris was saying, like this relationship between developer and publisher should be a marriage, right? And they're ideally, and they're, as part of that, you kind of want to eliminate the notion of surprises, right? So in a perfect world, there wouldn't be a sort of a rating surprise. Like you might have an expectation going in, and this comes from more of the perspective of starting a project from scratch with a developer. You might have some idea of what you want, or you might not, and you kind of go along and see where you end up, and then maybe a platform comes along that's interested in the project or interested in exclusivity, and they have a specific mandate with respect to a rating. Whereas if you were hiring a development team to develop something based off an existing idea, and you kind of had these four corner parameters of exactly what the product should be, then yeah, I think it would behoove you to monitor very closely sort of throughout the process to make sure that you don't go awry, because then that's sort of a misuse of the investment, right, in that project. But for us, and just I think generally, if you're kind of creating something from scratch and it's new IP, and you kind of go along, and where, like Chris has said a few times, I think where you start out might not be where you end up, but where you end up could be something really great and unexpected, and then you kind of go from there. So
okay, I was just going to move on, kind of touch upon the compensation provisions, the manner of payment. In this agreement, section 3.1, there's a development fee that applies only in the circumstance that you're paying somebody to actually develop the product here. And that development fee obviously would not apply if you're just acquiring a completed property, in which case you're basically jumping right to 3.2 and the revenue share. And this is obviously a negotiable point here in terms of the split is going to be as between the developer and the publisher generally. And then of course, as you look down, what is it that is based on here? The revenue share talks about the no revenue share will be paid until publisher has fully recouped the amount in the schedule, which includes the development costs. So you may have a deal, for example, which says, sure, we'll split the revenue share. How is that defined? Net, gross? If it's net, how do you get to net? Is it adjusted gross? You see these terms. But in there you say, but first, before we even get to that, we, the publisher, want to recoup our out-of-pocket costs that we paid you, be it through the development fee or sometimes marketing materials or anything else in there, so that you get recouped before you get your money back, before you start sharing the revenue with the developer. I guess if you look at net receipts, that gives you kind of the description in there of what constitutes net game receipts from the sales. This provision will have typically in their provision for using promotional copies or that sort of thing. You can say, yeah, there will be no charge, no split for certain copies used for promotional purposes. One of the keys here is that we always negotiate 3.6 is the developer in this case has audit rights. If I'm the developer, I want the ability to look at the books and the records of the publisher specifically, so I can say, hey, I think you're earning more than you're telling me, or you're shorting me, you're not paying me everything that you're supposed to. And so typically we put in there provision that maybe once a year you have the right to hire a CPA and bring the CPA in there. And this one's kind of favorable. This is a provision that I fight over regularly when it talks about any cost associated with the audit. Typically the developer is responsible to incur the costs of going in there and performing this audit. If I'm the developer, I want to go in and I want to inspect Chris's books and records, and I send the CPA in there, I have to pay for that. But if you look at the very bottom of 3.6 here, it talks about any costs associated with the audit are borne by the developer unless there's a discrepancy of more than 10% between the revenue share actually paid and the revenue share actually owed. What that means is if I go in there and I see that, if there's some minor problems with Chris's accounting and books and records, sorry for picking on you, Chris. I know you're very diligent. But if I'm going in there and I'm dissecting your books and records and I find minor discrepancies, yeah, you know, you paid me 100,000, but you owed me 101,000. No big deal. Pay me the other 1,000. We'll call it a day. But if the discrepancy is large, in this case 10%, sometimes I might say I try to get 5% if I'm representing the developer in this situation. I want to say if there's a discrepancy of 5% or more, meaning you owe me, I don't know if the math adds up because of the variations, but if the discrepancy is maybe you owed me $106,000 and you only paid me $100,000, why should I have to incur the cost of fixing your work? It's a large enough discrepancy. I had to hire somebody to go in there and figure it out, and I shouldn't have to pay for it. So again, if I'm the developer here, I want 5%. If I'm the publisher, I want 10%. Some companies will say, no, we're not going to pay for it under any circumstance. You want to do it, fine, inspect our books and records, but we don't care if there's a discrepancy or not. And it's a negotiable point. It's a point you fight on. 10%, reasonable enough. I'm going to want to see 5% if I'm the developer in there, because again, I should not have to pay for the publisher's mistake or negligence or, you know, whatever it is in there. If you look down this, we get the 3.8 here. That's the promotional copies I had alluded to elsewhere. 4, we already covered. That's the term and territory of the agreement. In this case, the territory is set forth in the schedule, so we don't have it here. I'll just assume it's worldwide or universe. Again, one and the same thing. Term here, when you're talking about a term, other things apply, and you have to deal with what happens after the term. What happens with some of the licensed material? We touched on this last week. If the licensed material is incorporated into a final work and the term expires, am I supposed to just stop selling it because the license you granted me ceases to exist? Obviously, if I'm the publisher, at a minimum, I want, if it's physical copies, for example, I want a sell-off period, which says I have the right to sell this stuff off. My rights as publisher may expire, you know, in that context, but there's going to be a residual period where this stuff is selling. You also have to talk about, when you're dealing with the term, are there any reversion of rights? Who's keeping the rights? Lastly, for our purposes, you look at paragraph 6. That talks about ownership and proprietary material or information here. And in this particular case, developer, this will be the last thing I guess we have time to touch on, developer owns the property here, which is unusual because, to me, because the publisher is paying the developer to develop the property. I think in this situation, kind of a work for hire, and the publisher may want the rights. If they're paying for the development, they may want to own everything that's developed. Real quickly, because it's an important point, starting with Jordan, what are your thoughts on publisher versus developer ownership of the IP that's developed under an agreement?
Yeah, we tend to look at things on a case by case, you know, game per game, project per project basis. So again, like going back to the, you know, in a perfect world, in sort of a vacuum, right? A publisher, if you were putting out money in exchange for, you know, the acquisition of rights to a creative project, in theory, you would want as many rights as possible, and sort of one of those sort of ultimate rights, especially, you know, is ownership. But that's not necessarily how it plays out in the real world, and different people have different interests, right? And one of those interests might be owning, you know, your own IP, and in which case we're definitely open to considering that, you know, depending on the totality of the circumstances of the project as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, at the scale we operate at as a very indie publisher, it's a given that IP rights sit with the developer, but it's all a trade-off, right? Ultimately, if you want to own the IP, you will be paying more for the development, right? You'll be paying for either 100% or almost 100%. But if the developer is putting in their sort of sweat, blood, and creative energy, and you're only funding 30% of the development, you know, then you certainly won't own the IP. So there's also a question of value of the IP in the independent game space. Sequels are not really a substantial thing, to be honest. Like most big successful indie games don't go on to have a big successful sequel, and there's some exceptions, but it's not as common as it would be in the, say, the AAA game development world, where Call of Duty goes on to make, you know, year after year after year, just ship a new game. So for us, it's often a case of like, what's the value of the IP? of having the IP, and what would that cost? And for us, it's not worth the cost of what it would cost to own that IP, but in other circumstances it will. So it sort of varies case by case, game to game, what that trade-off is.
Well, we deal strictly at this point in licensed IP. So for example, our new title is Tarzan. So we obviously the developer can't own Tarzan, et cetera. So that's not really a question. They can't retain it because we don't even own it. We're licensing it. But there are certain things that a developer may bring to the project. Like there might be certain inventions of some sort or intellectual property that they may be bringing to the licensed title and the work for hire that they're conducting under the work for hire agreement. And I'm happy we've allowed, like some kind of shader or something of that nature that is maybe proprietary to their company. We're fine with letting those companies hold those, own those IP, that IP after the fact, because it's not related to the license, but also as long as they give us a perpetual license to that specific intellectual property, in perpetuity to whatever IP. Just they own it, but we get to license it, and we can't monetize it, but we get to own it, so we can use it in our product that we're actually selling.
And I guess the last point, because we have to wrap up, is these IP rights can be important. Again, content creators, you create a story, ends up in a game. If you're a publisher, that's the tension there. If the game is successful and maybe somebody, as happens now, somebody wants to go ahead and make a movie out of it, whether it's Prince of Persia or Tomb Raider or Doom or on and on and on with these things. These all started as gaming properties, but their value is they can expand beyond the gaming universe. Depending upon who owns that IP, they can monetize it in books or movies or television shows or any other method. And that's really ultimately the value of trying to retain or acquire those IP rights.